When a zoo employee threw a black boy into the lion enclosure, everyone thought tragedy would strike, but no one could have predicted what would happen next. Subscribe and comment. Where are you watching this from? The early morning sunlight filtered through the curtains of the small, cozy apartment where the Johnson family lived. The day had been planned out meticulously. Antonio Johnson, along with his wife Monica and their young son Jaden, were about to experience a family day that would be the fulfillment of a long-held promise. Today was Jaden's first trip to the zoo, and for Antonio, it was also a personal milestone. He had never been to a zoo as a child. His parents hadn't been able to afford such excursions, and so this outing held a special significance. Antonio had always envisioned that one day he would share this experience with his own child, and he was determined to make it memorable. Breakfast was lively. Jaden, barely able to sit still, was practically buzzing with excitement, his voice a constant stream of questions about lions, tigers, and enormous elephants. He had already been up for hours, preparing his little backpack with essentials, a small water bottle, his favorite superhero figurine, and the well-loved picture book about wild animals that had sparked his interest in the zoo in the first place. Monica smiled as she watched her son's eagerness, though she exchanged a look with Antonio, silently acknowledging the unspoken concerns they both harbored. The Johnsons weren't strangers to glances or judgment. Whether it was walking through stores or waiting at bus stops, there were always those whose gazes lingered a little too long, as if their family of three, proud, joyful, and loving, was somehow surprising. But Antonio was adamant about one thing. He would never let those looks define their lives or taint the experiences he wanted Jaden to have. Today, however, he felt that small knot of worry, aware that even a joyful outing could be shadowed by prejudice. As they left the house, he took a deep breath, reminded himself of his resolve, and held his son's hand just a little tighter. The drive to the zoo was filled with lively chatter as Jaden peppered his parents with questions, his eyes wide with anticipation. He had an endless list of animals he wanted to see, starting with lions, his absolute favorite. Antonio laughed as he recalled the countless evenings he had spent with Jaden on his lap, flipping through his animal book as Jaden learned to mimic the sounds each creature made. Lions held a special place in Jaden's imagination. He often talked about wanting to be brave like one. The zoo's entrance was bustling with families and tourists, the noise and movement only adding to Jaden's excitement. They waited in line to buy tickets, Jaden craning his neck to catch glimpses of animals from the entrance. As Antonio finally handed the tickets to the attendant, he noticed a staff member standing nearby, eyeing them with a frown. The man, whose name tag read Douglas, was dressed in the zoo's green uniform, but his expression was anything but welcoming. Antonio ignored it. He was used to brushing off looks from strangers, and besides, nothing could spoil this day for him and his family. As they entered the zoo, they were greeted by the cheerful sight of colorful displays and large signboards guiding visitors to different exhibits. Jaden immediately tugged on his father's hand, urging him toward the lion enclosure. But Antonio was insistent they pace themselves, reminding Jaden that there was so much to see and that they would have plenty of time to explore each area. The first stop was the aviary, a wide, netted dome filled with vibrant tropical birds flitting from branch to branch. Jaden's laughter filled the air as a bright blue parrot perched close to him, eyeing him curiously. Monica took out her camera, capturing the wonder in her son's eyes as he interacted with the birds. Antonio felt a pang of happiness watching them. This was what he'd always wanted, a happy family, making memories together. As they moved through the aviary, Antonio noticed Douglas lingering nearby, still watching them with a strange intensity. Antonio couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something unsettling about the man's gaze. He chose to shrug it off, focusing instead on Jaden's enthusiasm. They continued to the reptile house, where Jaden marveled at the enormous snakes and brightly colored lizards. Antonio couldn't help but laugh at his son's reaction to a particularly large python who lay coiled under a heat lamp, its scales gleaming in the dim light. Monica took his hand, her eyes sparkling with joy as they watched Jaden's fascination. For a moment, Antonio forgot about everything else, immersing himself in his son's happiness and the warmth of his wife's presence. After a quick snack break, they made their way toward the main attraction, the lion enclosure. As they approached, Jaden's excitement reached a fever pitch. The enclosure was surrounded by tall glass walls that allowed visitors a clear view of the lions who lay basking in the midday sun. Jaden pressed his hands against the glass, his mouth agape as he watched the majestic creatures lounging just a few feet away. One of the lions lifted its head, its amber eyes locking onto Jaden's for a brief, electrifying moment. Jaden's face lit up with pure awe, and Antonio felt a swell of pride. His son, brave and unafraid, mesmerized by the very creature he admired most. But as Antonio looked around, he noticed Douglas standing a few paces away, watching them with that same unsettling intensity. The man's expression had darkened, and Antonio felt a chill run down his spine. There was something almost hostile in the way Douglas looked at them, as if he resented their happiness. Antonio felt his jaw tighten, a familiar anger bubbling up inside him. He had spent his entire life learning to navigate these unspoken hostilities, the quiet judgments and dismissive looks. But today, for Jaden's sake, he decided to hold his tongue. Monica, too, had noticed Douglas's stare, though she chose to brush it off. She placed a reassuring hand on Antonio's arm, sensing his unease. "Let's keep going," she said softly, nodding toward a family-friendly picnic area where they could sit and enjoy a moment of quiet. Antonio nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He decided to stay alert, hoping that he was simply overreacting. The day continued with more laughter, more shared moments. They visited the monkey enclosure, where Jaden erupted in giggles at the antics of a baby chimp swinging from tree to tree. They explored the aquarium, where shimmering schools of fish darted in unison, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across Jaden's delighted face. Everywhere they went, Antonio felt his heart swell with gratitude for this simple, beautiful day. Yet the shadow of Douglas's dark gaze lingered in his mind, a constant, uneasy presence that he couldn't quite dismiss. As they began to wrap up their visit, Antonio caught sight of Douglas once more, standing near the exit, his arms folded and his face set in a hard, almost challenging expression. Antonio's mind raced. He didn't know what to make of Douglas's apparent animosity, but one thing was clear. This man's presence had cast a shadow over their otherwise perfect day. Later that evening, as they drove home, Jaden was still buzzing with excitement, recounting every moment with breathless enthusiasm. Antonio and Monica exchanged a quiet look, both silently acknowledging the tension they had felt. Antonio resolved to stay vigilant, though he dismissed the day's discomfort, hoping it was merely his imagination. This day, he reminded himself, was a promise fulfilled, a memory that would live with them forever. The next weekend dawned bright and clear, perfect for another family outing. Antonio was eager to see Jaden's face light up again as he explored the animals he hadn't managed to see during their previous visit. Despite the strange interactions they'd had with Douglas, the excitement of seeing Jaden's curiosity bloom outweighed any lingering discomfort. They set out early, and the drive was filled with the same lively chatter and anticipation as before. Arriving at the zoo, Jaden ran ahead, his laughter ringing through the entrance as he scanned the map for their route. He was determined to see every animal this time. Antonio smiled, catching Monica's hand and giving it a gentle squeeze. "Today's going to be a good day," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. He hoped it would be anyway. The zoo was busier than usual, with families crowding the pathways and children darting from one exhibit to the next. Jaden, his small hand in his father's, led the way with excitement, his eyes lighting up at each new sight. As they made their way through the crowd, Antonio's eyes landed on a familiar figure just ahead. Douglas was back, his green uniform a sharp contrast against the greenery surrounding the entrance. The man's expression was as unfriendly as ever, his gaze settling on Antonio with the same quiet hostility that had unnerved him last time. Antonio hesitated, feeling the same chill run down his spine, but he took a deep breath, determined not to let anything spoil Jaden's day. They'd come here for a family experience, and that's what they would focus on. Pushing the uncomfortable feeling aside, he guided his family towards the first exhibit, the tropical rainforest section, filled with exotic birds and brightly colored foliage. Jaden was captivated by the vibrant parrots perched high on the branches, their feathers gleaming in the sunlight as they called out in shrill voices. Monica laughed as Jaden imitated their squawks, waving his arms as if he had wings of his own. Antonio couldn't help but smile, the unease slipping away as he watched his son's joy. But as they moved deeper into the exhibit, he caught sight of Douglas again, this time standing near the entrance of the next section, watching them. Antonio's heart sank. Douglas seemed to be everywhere today, his gaze trailing the family as they moved from one exhibit to the next. At first, Antonio tried to ignore it, reminding himself that this was a public place and Douglas was just doing his job. But the repeated glances, the way Douglas lingered just out of earshot, unsettled him. It was almost as if Douglas was waiting for something. Monica, sensing Antonio's discomfort, leaned in and whispered, "Is he bothering you again?" She cast a quick glance in Douglas's direction, her eyes narrowing slightly. Antonio nodded, his jaw tense. "He hasn't said anything, but it's the way he keeps watching us," Antonio replied softly, trying not to alarm Jaden, who was now engrossed in the information plaque about jaguars. Monica gave Antonio's hand a reassuring squeeze. "Let's not let him ruin today. We're here to make memories with Jaden, remember?" Antonio nodded, determined to push past the feeling. They continued through the rainforest exhibit, but Douglas's presence hung over them like a shadow. As they moved on to the African savanna section, Jaden's excitement grew, especially when he caught sight of the zebra and giraffe enclosures. He bounced up and down, tugging on his father's sleeve, chattering nonstop about how tall and amazing the animals were. Antonio tried to focus on his son's happiness, but he could still feel Douglas's gaze following them from a distance. Their journey through the zoo continued, with Jaden's laughter filling the air as he encountered one animal after another. They explored the kangaroo paddock, the reptile house, and even the nocturnal exhibit, where Jaden squealed in delight at the sight of a sleepy owl. Antonio began to relax again, the joy in his son's eyes reminding him of why they were here. Then they arrived at the lion enclosure. Jaden pressed his face against the glass, his eyes wide with awe as he watched the lions bask in the sun. One of the lions stretched lazily, yawning as it revealed its enormous teeth. Jaden was thrilled, barely able to contain his excitement as he chattered to his parents about how brave and strong lions were. But as they watched, Douglas appeared again, standing near the corner of the enclosure. This time his expression was darker, his gaze fixed on Jaden with an intensity that sent a shiver down Antonio's spine. Antonio felt his fists clench at his sides. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Douglas's behavior was no longer just uncomfortable. It was intimidating. Jaden, oblivious to the tension, continued to marvel at the lions. Monica moved closer to Antonio, her face drawn with concern. "He's really pushing it, isn't he?" she murmured, her voice barely audible over Jaden's excited chatter. Antonio nodded, his jaw clenched. He was tempted to confront Douglas, but he didn't want to cause a scene. Not here, not in front of his son. As they were about to move on, a group of visitors passed by, crowding around the enclosure. Antonio and Monica took the opportunity to guide Jaden toward the exit, hoping that the crowd would deter Douglas from following them. But as they turned to leave, Antonio felt a sudden, sharp shove from behind. He stumbled, catching himself just in time to avoid falling. He turned around, heart pounding, but Douglas had already vanished into the crowd. Monica looked at him, eyes wide with alarm. "Antonio, are you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with worry. Antonio nodded, though his hands were shaking. He looked around, but there was no sign of Douglas. He wanted to believe it had been an accident, that maybe someone in the crowd had bumped into him unintentionally. But deep down, he knew it hadn't been. As they left the lion enclosure, Antonio's mind was racing. He couldn't understand why Douglas had such a problem with them, but he was certain of one thing. This was no coincidence. He kept a tight grip on Jaden's hand, determined to keep his family safe. They decided to take a break at the picnic area, hoping to shake off the lingering tension. Jaden, blissfully unaware of the events that had unfolded, dug into his sandwich, happily recounting the highlights of his day so far. Antonio forced himself to smile, listening to his son's innocent excitement, but he couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that gnawed at him. As they finished their lunch, Antonio noticed Douglas approaching again, this time with a small group of other zoo staff members. He watched, his muscles tensing as Douglas whispered something to his colleagues, casting a pointed glance in their direction. Antonio felt a surge of anger rise within him. He didn't know what Douglas's problem was, but he wasn't about to let it go unchecked. Monica placed a calming hand on his arm. "Let's just finish the day, for Jaden," she said softly, her eyes filled with concern. Antonio took a deep breath, nodding as he tried to calm himself. They decided to visit the last few exhibits quickly, hoping to avoid any further encounters with Douglas, but just as they were about to leave, they ran into him one last time. Douglas stepped directly into their path, blocking their way. His expression was unreadable, but the hostility in his eyes was unmistakable. Jaden looked up at him, wide-eyed and curious, unaware of the tension between the adults. Antonio forced himself to stay calm, his voice low as he addressed Douglas. "Excuse us. We're just trying to enjoy the day with our son." Douglas's lips twisted into a smirk. "Funny. Some people don't know their place," he muttered, just loud enough for Antonio to hear. Antonio felt his blood boil, but he kept his composure, determined not to give Douglas the satisfaction of a reaction. With a quiet nod, Antonio guided his family past Douglas, his mind racing. He was done tolerating this. He would file a complaint, make sure that Douglas's behavior was addressed. As they walked toward the exit, he glanced down at Jaden, who was still chattering about the lions. Antonio felt a surge of determination. He would protect his family, no matter what it took. But just as they reached the final exhibit, disaster struck. Douglas appeared once more, and this time he acted. With a quick, deliberate movement, he shoved Jaden toward the lion enclosure. Time seemed to slow as Jaden stumbled, his small body teetering dangerously close to the edge. Antonio's heart stopped as he lunged forward, but it was too late. Jaden tumbled into the enclosure, his scream echoing in the air. The world froze around Antonio as he watched his son fall, his mind racing with horror and disbelief. The crowd erupted in screams as people realized what had happened, but all Antonio could focus on was Jaden, lying motionless at the bottom of the enclosure. As the lions stirred, their eyes fixing on the small figure before them, Antonio felt a terror unlike anything he had ever known. This was his worst nightmare come true, his son alone and helpless, face to face with danger. And it had all been because of Douglas. Jaden's scream pierced the air, sending a shockwave of terror through the crowd gathered around the lion enclosure. Antonio's heart stopped as he watched his son tumble down the embankment, landing hard on the ground inside the massive enclosure. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching out into eternity as Antonio processed the nightmare unfolding before him. Jaden was in the lion's territory, surrounded by barriers that kept visitors out, but now trapped his son in. Monica's scream joined the chaos as she tried to climb over the railing, but Antonio, his instincts kicking in, pulled her back. He couldn't afford to let anything happen to her, too. Around them, the crowd gasped, screamed, and murmured in horror. Antonio felt his entire world shrink to the sight of his son lying motionless just a few feet away from the lions. Jaden slowly pushed himself up, his little hands pressing against the hard earth as he struggled to get his bearings. His small body trembled, a mixture of pain and shock leaving him frozen in place. He looked around, wide-eyed at the foreign surroundings, and it took only a moment for his gaze to lock onto the massive lions sprawled just a few yards away. One of the lions, a large male with a thick golden mane, lifted his head, his amber eyes fixed intently on the small figure that had appeared in his territory. Jaden's breath hitched as he felt the lion's gaze on him, its powerful presence filling him with an overwhelming fear. He wanted to call out to his parents, but his voice felt trapped in his throat. All he could do was stare at the creature, his heart pounding in his chest. Above him, Antonio gripped the edge of the barrier, his knuckles white with tension. "Jaden, stay still," he shouted, his voice shaking as he fought to remain calm. He knew that any sudden movements could provoke the lions, and the thought of his son being attacked was more than he could bear. Beside him, Monica clung to his arm, her face pale and streaked with tears as she whispered Jaden's name over and over, her voice filled with raw, desperate fear. Jaden, hearing his father's command, forced himself to stay as still as possible, though his entire body was screaming for him to run, to get as far away from the lions as he could. He could feel the coarse earth beneath his hands, the hot sun beating down on him, and the weight of the lion's gaze pressing on him like a physical force. He was terrified, but he knew he had to trust his father. Antonio had always told him to be brave, to face his fears. And now, more than ever, he needed to hold on to that advice. The lion rose slowly, its powerful muscles rippling beneath its tawny fur as it began to approach Jaden with slow, deliberate steps. Its eyes never left the boy, and each step it took seemed to echo through the silence that had fallen over the crowd. Jaden's heart hammered in his chest, his mind racing with thoughts of escape, but he stayed rooted to the spot, hoping that somehow the lion wouldn't see him as a threat. Around them, zookeepers were shouting into their radios, calling for immediate assistance. Antonio could hear the frantic voices, but they were a distant blur compared to the sight of his son, so small and vulnerable, face to face with one of the most powerful predators in the world. He gripped Monica's hand tightly, his mind racing with helplessness and rage. He knew that Douglas was behind this. He had seen the man's cruel smirk as he pushed Jaden into the enclosure. But for now, all that mattered was getting Jaden out of there alive. As the lion drew closer, Jaden found himself transfixed by the animal's presence. Despite his fear, there was something mesmerizing about the lion. Its strength, its grace, the way it moved with a quiet, lethal power. Jaden had always dreamed of seeing a lion up close, but never like this. He could feel the weight of its gaze, a mixture of curiosity and something else, something he couldn't quite understand. He remembered the countless times he had told his parents that he wanted to be brave like a lion, and now, facing the creature he admired most, he realized what real bravery felt like. The lion stopped just a few feet away, lowering its head to study him more closely. Jaden held his breath, his eyes wide as he looked into the lion's golden eyes. In that moment, everything around him seemed to fade away. The noise of the crowd, the distant shouts of the zookeepers, even the sound of his own heartbeat. All that existed was the lion, and the strange, almost serene connection he felt with it. He remembered his father's words about bravery, about how facing fear didn't mean the fear went away, but that you learned to stand in its presence. Jaden took a deep breath, his small hands trembling as he willed himself to stay calm. The lion's gaze softened, and for a moment, Jaden felt as though the animal understood him, as though it could sense his fear and was offering him a silent reassurance. The crowd gasped as the lion lifted one massive paw, stepping even closer to the boy. Antonio's heart raced as he watched, helpless to do anything but pray that his son would be spared. He knew that the next few seconds would decide everything, and he clung to Monica, his mind a torrent of emotions, fear, anger, hope. But then something incredible happened. The lion stopped, its head tilting slightly as it regarded Jaden with what seemed like an almost gentle curiosity. Jaden, his courage bolstered by the animal's unexpected behavior, slowly extended his hand, his fingers trembling as he reached out toward the lion. He wasn't sure what he was doing, but something inside him told him that he needed to show the lion he wasn't afraid. The lion lowered its head, its nose just inches from Jaden's outstretched hand. Jaden held his breath, his entire body tense as he waited for the lion's reaction. And then, to everyone's astonishment, the lion leaned forward and gently nuzzled Jaden's hand, its rough tongue brushing against his fingers in a gesture of unexpected gentleness. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, the tension breaking as people watched in stunned silence. Antonio felt a wave of relief wash over him, his knees weak as he watched the lion interact with his son. Monica sobbed quietly, her hands covering her mouth as she struggled to process the miraculous scene unfolding before them. Jaden, feeling a surge of courage, managed a small smile as he looked up at the lion, his fear replaced by a sense of wonder and gratitude. For a brief, precious moment, Jaden and the lion stood together, two beings from different worlds, united by an unspoken understanding. Jaden felt as though the lion could see into his heart, could sense his innocence and bravery. He had always wanted to be brave like a lion, and now he felt as though he had earned the creature's respect. The lion gave one final nuzzle before turning away, retreating to the shade of a nearby rock. Jaden watched it go, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and sadness. He knew that he would likely never experience anything like this again, but he felt grateful for the connection he had shared with the animal, however brief it had been. As the zookeepers finally reached the enclosure, one of them carefully approached Jaden, his voice soothing as he reassured the boy that he would be safe. Antonio and Monica watched, their hearts in their throats, as the zookeeper lifted Jaden into his arms, carrying him back to the safety of the visitor area. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, relieved and amazed by the miraculous encounter they had just witnessed. Antonio and Monica rushed forward, wrapping Jaden in a tight embrace as they held him close, their emotions overwhelming. Antonio's eyes filled with tears as he kissed the top of his son's head, whispering words of comfort and love. Jaden, though shaken, managed a small smile as he looked up at his parents, his voice barely a whisper. "I wasn't scared, Daddy. The lion knew I was brave." Antonio hugged him tighter, a heart bursting with pride and relief. "You were so brave, Jaden. I'm so proud of you." He held his son close, grateful beyond words that Jaden had survived the ordeal. As they left the enclosure, Antonio caught sight of Douglas standing nearby, a look of shock and frustration etched across his face. Antonio felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on getting his family to safety. He knew that there would be time to confront Douglas later, to demand answers and hold him accountable for what he had done. But, for now, all that mattered was that Jaden was safe. The world seemed to hold its breath as Jaden lay on the ground, eyes locked on the lion that loomed over him. The animal's amber eyes gleamed with an intense, watchful gaze, and every fiber of Jaden's being was overcome with fear, yet something deeper kept him rooted to the spot. Despite the terror running through his veins, he knew he had to stay as still as possible, just as his father had told him. The lion's gaze was unblinking, steady, and somehow Jaden felt a calmness settle over him. He had always dreamed of seeing a lion up close, but nothing in his imagination had prepared him for this moment. The creature's sheer size, the power that emanated from it, was awe-inspiring. As it took another step toward him, Jaden couldn't help but remember the countless times he'd told his father he wanted to be brave like a lion. Now, face to face with the animal, he understood that bravery didn't mean the absence of fear, but the courage to stand in the face of it. The lion moved closer, its breath hot and steady, washing over him as it sniffed the air, familiarizing itself with the scent of this small, trembling figure before it. Jaden held his breath, his heart pounding as he waited for whatever would come next. But as he watched, he began to notice something unexpected. The lion didn't seem angry or threatened. In fact, there was a strange, gentle curiosity in its gaze, as if it was just as unsure of him as he was of it. As he watched, Jaden felt his fear start to dissolve, replaced by a sense of wonder and awe. The lion was the most magnificent creature he had ever seen, and in that moment, he forgot about the crowd, the noise, even his own fear. All that existed was the lion, and the quiet connection he felt with it. He could feel the rough earth beneath him, the sun warming his skin, and the quiet, steady presence of the animal before him. The lion lifted a massive paw, its sharp claws retracting as it gently stepped closer. Jaden held still, his gaze never leaving the lion's face. The crowd around them was deathly silent, every eye locked on the boy and the lion, as if the entire world had stopped to witness this impossible moment. Jaden extended his hand, his fingers trembling as he reached out toward the lion. He didn't know why he was doing it. He only knew that something deep inside him urged him to show the lion that he was unafraid. Slowly, with a grace that seemed almost unreal, the lion lowered its head, its nose just inches from Jaden's outstretched fingers. The lion sniffed at his hand. Then, in a gesture that left the crowd breathless, it extended its tongue, rough and warm, and licked his fingers. Jaden felt a thrill run through him, a mixture of relief and astonishment. He was touching a lion, a creature of unimaginable power and grace, and it had accepted him. The lion's gaze softened, and Jaden sensed an understanding pass between them, as though the lion recognized something familiar in him. He wasn't a threat. He was simply a small, vulnerable creature, curious and brave. For the first time in his life, Jaden felt a strange sense of kinship with the lion, a bond that defied words or explanations. The crowd gasped, murmuring in astonishment as they watched the scene unfold. Antonio and Monica clutched each other, their eyes brimming with tears as they watched their son's courage and the inexplicable connection he had formed with this magnificent beast. Antonio felt a swell of pride, mixed with a profound sense of gratitude that Jaden was safe, if only for this moment. The lion gave one last, gentle nuzzle before stepping back, its massive frame casting a shadow over Jaden as it retreated to the shade of a nearby rock. Jaden watched it go, his heart full of wonder and a strange sadness. He knew he might never experience anything like this again, but he was grateful for the bond he had shared with the animal, however brief it had been. As he stood, a zookeeper, cautious and soft-spoken, approached him, offering words of reassurance and guidance as he gently lifted Jaden and carried him out of the enclosure. Jaden felt a sense of relief and exhaustion wash over him as he was brought back to safety. He looked over his shoulder, catching one last glimpse of the lion, who watched him with the same calm, understanding gaze. The crowd erupted in applause as Jaden was returned to his parents, their cheers mingling with the sounds of relief and admiration. Antonio and Monica rushed forward, wrapping him in their arms as they held him close, their voices a mixture of gratitude and emotion. Jaden, though shaken, managed a small, weary smile as he looked up at his parents, his voice barely a whisper. "I wasn't scared, Daddy. The lion knew I was brave." Antonio hugged him tightly, his own voice choked with emotion. "You were brave, Jaden. I'm so proud of you." He held his son close, his heart full of pride and relief. As they began to leave the enclosure, Antonio caught sight of Douglas standing nearby, his face pale and his expression conflicted. The sight of him ignited a surge of anger in Antonio, who knew without a doubt that Douglas had pushed Jaden into the enclosure. He felt an overwhelming urge to confront him, to demand answers for the danger he had put Jaden in. But for now, his priority was getting his family to safety. Antonio guided Monica and Jaden through the crowd, his mind racing with thoughts of what he would do next. He knew that Douglas would have to answer for what he had done, that this incident couldn't be ignored or swept under the rug. But at this moment, as he looked down at Jaden, safe and sound in his arms, he felt a deep sense of gratitude that his son had survived. Jaden, exhausted from the ordeal, leaned his head against his father's shoulder, his eyes drifting shut as they walked toward the exit. The day had been full of unimaginable events, but somehow he felt a strange sense of peace. He had faced his greatest fear and had come through it, not alone, but with the quiet, powerful presence of the lion by his side. As they reached the car, Antonio placed Jaden in his seat, securing him carefully as he exchanged a look with Monica. They both knew that their lives would never be the same after today. There would be questions, investigations, and consequences for Douglas's actions. But for now, all that mattered was that they were together, safe and whole. As they drove away, Jaden looked out the window, his mind replaying the incredible moments he had shared with the lion. He knew he would never forget that feeling, the sense of connection, of mutual respect and understanding. And as he closed his eyes, he whispered softly, "Thank you," knowing that somewhere the lion understood. The return home was anything but quiet. The adrenaline from the day's events had left Antonio, Monica, and Jaden in a state of shock, their minds racing with the implications of what had happened. Jaden, exhausted and subdued, had fallen asleep almost immediately after dinner, leaving his parents alone in the dimly lit living room, their minds swirling with emotions that defied words. Antonio sat on the couch, his hands clasped tightly together, his gaze fixed on a distant point as he replayed the incident over and over. He couldn't shake the image of Douglas's expression, the twisted satisfaction that had flickered across his face just before he shoved Jaden into the lion's enclosure. The memory ignited a burning anger within him, an intense need for justice that he couldn't ignore. Monica sat beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder as she watched him with concern. "Antonio," she said softly, her voice breaking through the tense silence. "We can't let this go. He endangered our son's life. We have to make sure he's held accountable." Antonio nodded, his jaw clenched as he thought about the steps they would need to take. "I know," he replied, his voice steely with resolve. "We'll talk to a lawyer. There's no way I'm letting him get away with this. Jaden could have." His voice trailed off, the weight of the unspoken words hanging heavily in the air. He couldn't bear to finish the thought, to consider the unthinkable possibility of what might have happened. Early the next morning, Antonio and Monica contacted a lawyer, determined to pursue justice for the ordeal their son had endured. The lawyer, a calm and confident man named Harold Green, listened intently as they recounted the events of the previous day. He assured them that their case was strong, that the zoo would be held responsible for the actions of its employees, and that Douglas would face serious consequences for his reckless and malicious behavior. Harold wasted no time in contacting the zoo's management, arranging a meeting to discuss the incident and ensure that proper measures were taken. Antonio and Monica attended the meeting with a mixture of anger and determination, prepared to demand accountability for the trauma their family had endured. The zoo's director, a middle-aged woman with a sympathetic expression, listened to their account with shock and dismay. "We deeply regret what happened to your son," she said, her voice filled with genuine remorse. "This incident is absolutely unacceptable, and I assure you that we are taking it very seriously. Douglas has been suspended pending a full investigation, and we will do everything in our power to ensure that he faces the consequences of his actions." Antonio's eyes narrowed as he studied her, searching for any hint of insincerity. "I don't want just words," he said, his tone firm. "I want to know that something like this will never happen again. Our son could have been killed." The director nodded, her expression somber. "I understand, Mr. Johnson. We are committed to making significant changes to prevent any future incidents. We are also willing to offer compensation for the trauma your family has experienced, though I know that can't make up for what happened. We want to make this right." As they left the meeting, Antonio felt a small measure of satisfaction, though the anger still simmered beneath the surface. He knew that this was only the beginning. that Douglas would have to face the full weight of the consequences for what he had done. Over the next few days, the incident began to attract media attention, with news outlets eager to report on the shocking story of a child who had narrowly escaped death at the zoo. Antonio and Monica found themselves in the spotlight, sharing their story in interviews as they called for justice and demanded accountability. Public opinion quickly turned in their favor, with many expressing outrage over the zoo's failure to protect its visitors and the blatant act of malice that had put Jaden's life in danger. Douglas's motives came under scrutiny as well, with investigators digging into his past in search of any previous incidents that might reveal a pattern of behavior. The investigation revealed troubling details about Douglas's past, a history of complaints from both colleagues and visitors who had reported his hostile and aggressive demeanor. His actions were no longer seen as an isolated incident, but as part of a larger pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for too long. As public pressure mounted, the zoo released a formal statement, apologizing to the Johnson family and announcing a series of reforms aimed at improving visitor safety and employee oversight. The statement acknowledged the unacceptable actions of Douglas and assured the public that he would face the appropriate disciplinary measures. The community rallied around the Johnsons, offering their support and encouragement as they continued their fight for justice. Messages poured in from people who had been moved by Jaden's bravery, by his quiet courage in the face of unimaginable danger. Antonio and Monica were touched by the outpouring of kindness and solidarity, their determination strengthened by the knowledge that they were not alone. Despite the support they received, the emotional toll of the ordeal weighed heavily on them. Jaden struggled with nightmares in the weeks that followed, his sleep disturbed by vivid memories of the lion's gaze and the sensation of falling. Antonio and Monica did their best to comfort him, to reassure him that he was safe, but they knew that the trauma he had experienced would take time to heal. One evening, as they sat together in Jaden's room, Antonio held his son close, listening as Jaden spoke quietly about his memories of the lion. "Daddy," he whispered, his voice tinged with both fear and wonder, "I thought the lion would hurt me, but he didn't. He was nice." Antonio felt a surge of emotion as he listened to his son's words, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "You were very brave, Jaden. You stayed calm, and you showed the lion that you weren't a threat. I'm so proud of you." Jaden looked up at his father, his eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. "Why did that man push me, Daddy? Did I do something wrong?" Antonio's heart broke at the question, his anger flaring as he thought about Douglas's cruelty. But he forced himself to remain calm, knowing that his son needed comfort, not anger. "No, Jaden," he replied gently. "You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes people do things that hurt others for reasons we can't understand. But you did nothing wrong." Jaden nodded slowly, his small hand clutching his father's shirt as he processed his father's words. "Will he do it again?" he asked softly, his voice barely a whisper. Antonio shook his head, his voice filled with conviction. "No, Jaden, he won't hurt you again. Mommy and I are making sure of that. We're going to protect you always." In the days that followed, Antonio and Monica focused on helping Jaden heal, encouraging him to talk about his feelings and reassuring him of his safety. They worked closely with the lawyer, gathering evidence and testimonies from witnesses who had seen Douglas's actions and were willing to speak out against him. The case moved forward, with Douglas facing charges of endangerment and reckless behavior. The zoo implemented stricter policies regarding employee conduct, determined to restore the trust that had been damaged by the incident. And though the journey was long and filled with challenges, Antonio and Monica found solace in the knowledge that justice was being served, that they had done everything in their power to protect their son and ensure that no other family would have to endure the same ordeal. As the trial date approached, Antonio reflected on the journey they had taken, the strength they had found within themselves and each other. He knew that they had faced an unimaginable challenge, but they had emerged stronger, united by their love for their son and their unwavering determination to seek justice. And in the quiet moments, as he held Jaden close, he reminded himself of the bravery his son had shown, the courage that had defied the odds and brought him safely back to them. Jaden's resilience had inspired him, had reminded him of the strength that lay within the bonds of family and the power of love to overcome even the darkest of challenges. The days following the incident were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and press coverage. The Johnson family had never expected to become the focus of a media frenzy, yet their story struck a chord with people across the city. Antonio had taken up the fight with a fervor he hadn't known he possessed, determined to bring Douglas to justice and make sure the zoo was held accountable for what they had allowed to happen. In the evenings, after Jaden had fallen asleep, Antonio would sit with Monica, reviewing notes from their lawyer and talking about the steps they would need to take. Each detail, every interview, every witness statement mattered. They were building a case that would hold Douglas accountable, not only for what he'd done to Jaden, but also for the pattern of hostility and aggression that had been ignored for too long. Antonio could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on him, knowing that he wasn't only fighting for Jaden, but for the safety of every family who would visit the zoo in the future. Their lawyer, Harold Green, was diligent and thorough, preparing a case that left no room for excuses. He had a way of speaking that made Antonio feel reassured, as though each word he said was a promise that they would see justice served. Harold had already gathered testimonies from several witnesses, including other employees who had observed Douglas's behavior toward visitors. It was clear that Douglas had harbored resentment and prejudice for years, and his act of pushing Jaden into the lion's enclosure was not just an isolated moment of malice, but the culmination of a deep-seated anger that had gone unchecked. Antonio and Monica worked closely with Harold, reviewing every detail of the case and making sure that they understood each step of the legal process. The media's attention on their story helped their cause, and more people came forward, sharing their own experiences with Douglas and expressing support for the Johnson family. As public pressure grew, the zoo found itself under intense scrutiny, facing demands for reform and transparency. To Antonio's relief, the community had rallied around them in a powerful show of solidarity. People from all walks of life reached out, sending messages of encouragement and expressing their outrage over what had happened to Jaden. Many parents shared their own stories of feeling unsafe or uncomfortable in public spaces, of fearing for their children's safety in a world that could be hostile and unkind. Antonio felt a profound sense of connection with these families, and their support strengthened his resolve to see the case through to the end. One evening, as Antonio prepared for another meeting with Harold, Monica approached him, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I was thinking," she began, "we should consider reaching out to some advocacy groups. I know this is a personal fight for us, but it's also a bigger issue. There are people who deal with situations like this every day, who are trying to make the world a safer place for families like ours." Antonio nodded, the idea resonating with him immediately. "You're right," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "This isn't just about us. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what Jaden went through. If we can make a difference, then we have to try. They reached out to several organizations focused on family safety, anti-bullying, and workplace accountability. To their surprise, many of these groups were eager to support them, offering resources, advice, and even volunteers who could help spread awareness about their case. With their backing, Antonio and Monica organized a community meeting to discuss the incident and the broader issues it raised. The meeting was held at a local community center, and to Antonio's surprise, the room was filled with people. Parents, teachers, activists, and concerned citizens had gathered to stand in solidarity with the Johnsons, their faces filled with a mix of anger and determination. Antonio felt a wave of gratitude wash over him as he looked around, realizing that they weren't alone in this fight. Harold stood by Antonio's side as he addressed the crowd, his voice strong and steady as he recounted the events that had brought them there. "My son was placed in unimaginable danger by someone who should have been protecting him, not harming him," Antonio said, his voice filled with emotion. "And while we are grateful that Jaden is safe, we can't ignore the fact that this could have ended very differently. We have to hold people accountable. We have to make sure that those who abuse their power are not allowed to continue." The room erupted in applause, the crowd's support bolstering Antonio's resolve. As he looked out at the faces of the people who had come to stand with them, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This fight wasn't just for Jaden. It was for every family who had ever felt vulnerable, every parent who had ever worried for their child's safety. Over the next several weeks, the case continued to build momentum. Harold filed a formal lawsuit against the zoo, accusing them of negligence in hiring and retaining Douglas despite his record of aggression. The lawsuit demanded both justice for Jaden and broader reforms to prevent future incidents. The media coverage intensified, and the zoo's management found themselves facing a wave of public criticism that threatened their reputation and credibility. Douglas, meanwhile, had been placed on leave and was under investigation by local authorities. The evidence against him was mounting, with witness testimonies and security footage that confirmed his actions. The community's outrage only grew as more details came to light, and many people called for harsher penalties, insisting that Douglas's actions warranted criminal charges. Throughout it all, Antonio and Monica remained focused on Jaden, who was slowly beginning to heal from the trauma he had endured. They worked with a counselor to help him process his emotions, encouraging him to talk about his feelings and fears. Jaden was resilient, his spirit unbroken despite the ordeal he had faced, but Antonio knew that healing would take time. One afternoon, as they sat in the living room, Jaden looked up at his father, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and curiosity. "Daddy," he said quietly, "do you think the lion remembers me?" Antonio smiled gently, his heart aching at the question. "I think he does, Jaden. I think he remembers that you were brave, and that you didn't try to hurt him. You were a friend to him, and I believe he remembers that." Jaden nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I want to go back someday. Not right now, but maybe when I'm older." Antonio placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "When you're ready, Jaden. We'll go back together and we'll make new memories. Good ones." The conversation with Jaden reinforced Antonio's commitment to the fight for justice. He knew that his son deserved to feel safe, that every child deserved a world where they could explore and experience life without fear. He was determined to see this battle through to the end, no matter how long it took. As the trial date approached, Antonio's focus intensified. He and Harold prepared diligently, reviewing every piece of evidence, every testimony, determined to build an unshakable case. They knew that the trial would be difficult, that Douglas's defense would attempt to deflect blame and minimize his actions. But Antonio was ready, bolstered by the strength of his family and the support of the community. On the morning of the trial, Antonio stood in the courthouse lobby, his heart pounding as he prepared to face Douglas for the first time since the incident. Monica stood beside him, her hand clasped in his, her presence a steadying force that reminded him of everything they had overcome together. He took a deep breath, his mind filled with the memories of that day, the terror he had felt as he watched Jaden fall, the relief that had washed over him when he saw his son safe in his arms. This was the moment they had been working toward, the culmination of months of pain, anger, and determination. Antonio knew that whatever happened in that courtroom, they had already won in the most important way. They had protected their son, and they had shown him that courage and resilience could overcome even the darkest of challenges. As the doors to the courtroom opened, Antonio squared his shoulders, his heart filled with a fierce sense of purpose. He was ready to fight, ready to stand up for his son and for every family who deserved justice and safety. And as he stepped forward, he knew that, no matter the outcome, he had already achieved something powerful. He had shown Jaden the true meaning of bravery. The courtroom was packed, the weight of anticipation filling the air as Antonio took his seat, Monica by his side, her hand tightly holding his. Across from them sat Douglas, his face impassive, but his eyes occasionally flickered with something that looked like anger. Antonio felt a rush of determination as he looked at the man who had tried to harm his family, and he knew that he was prepared for whatever would come. The trial was tense, with both sides presenting their arguments. The zoo's management testified, admitting that Douglas's behavior had been a growing concern and acknowledging that they should have acted sooner. Witnesses recounted Douglas's antagonistic demeanor and his tendency to be unkind to families like Antonio's. And of course, there was the security footage, the undeniable evidence of Douglas's shove, his malice laid bare for all to see. When Antonio took the stand, he spoke with a calm yet resolute tone, describing the horror of that day, the unimaginable fear he'd felt watching his son in the lion's enclosure, and the relief that Jaden had survived. He spoke not only for himself, but for every parent who had ever feared for their child's safety. The courtroom listened in rapt silence, the gravity of his words echoing through the room. The case against Douglas was strong, and as the trial wore on, it became clear that justice was within reach. Antonio felt a surge of hope as the judge handed down the verdict. Douglas was found guilty of endangerment and reckless behavior. He would face both legal penalties and a lifelong ban from any work involving public or family spaces. The court also mandated that the zoo implement new policies to improve safety and accountability. When the verdict was announced, the courtroom erupted in murmurs, a mixture of relief and satisfaction resonating through the crowd. Antonio felt a wave of relief wash over him. Justice had been served, and the nightmare that had haunted his family for months was finally over. After the trial, the zoo held a public event to address the incident and offer a formal apology to the Johnson family. The event was crowded with supporters, members of the media, and other families who had followed their story. The director of the zoo took the stage, her voice sincere as she expressed the zoo's regret for what had happened. She promised to make the zoo a safer place, to ensure that no family would ever face the same dangers that the Johnsons had endured. Then she invited Antonio to speak. Standing before the crowd, Antonio felt a mixture of emotions. He looked out at the faces before him, people who had come to support his family, who had stood with them in solidarity. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak, his voice steady and filled with purpose. "What happened to my son should never have happened to anyone," he said, his words resonating with the crowd. This incident wasn't just about one person's actions. It was a wake-up call. We all deserve to feel safe, to be treated with respect, regardless of who we are. And while I'm grateful for the justice we've seen today, I hope this is just the beginning. I hope that from now on, places like this will be places of joy and wonder, not fear. The crowd applauded, their faces reflecting the same hope and determination that Antonio felt. He looked over at Monica, who smiled up at him, her eyes shining with pride. Together, they had fought for their son, for justice, and for a safer world. After the event, the director invited Jaden to return to the zoo as an honorary guest. Though the memory of that day was still fresh in his mind, Jaden had grown stronger, his resilience a testament to his bravery. With his parents by his side, he walked through the zoo with his head held high, no longer afraid. The animals, once symbols of fear and danger, were now part of a new, brighter memory. When they reached the lion's enclosure, Jaden stopped, his eyes wide as he gazed at the creature that had once been his greatest fear and his greatest protector. The lion lay in the shade, its powerful body relaxed as it rested, its amber eyes watchful but calm. Jaden took a step closer, his face serious as he looked at the lion, remembering the bond they had shared in that fleeting, intense moment. "Thank you," he whispered, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You knew I wasn't your enemy." The lion's gaze met his, and for a moment it felt as though the animal understood. Jaden felt a strange peace settle over him, a sense of closure that allowed him to finally let go of the fear he had carried since that day. As they left the zoo, Antonio placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his heart swelling with pride. Jaden had faced an unimaginable challenge and emerged stronger, braver, and wiser. Antonio knew that whatever lay ahead, his son would face it with the same courage he had shown that day in the lion's enclosure. In the days that followed, life slowly returned to normal. The media's attention faded, and the Johnson family found peace in the quiet moments they shared at home, away from the spotlight. Antonio and Monica cherished each day, grateful for the resilience their family had shown, for the strength they had found in each other. Though the incident would remain a part of their story, it no longer defined them. They had faced fear, injustice, and prejudice, and they had triumphed. And in that triumph, they had found a new sense of purpose, a belief that justice, compassion, and forgiveness could change the world, one small act at a time. As the sun set on another peaceful day, Antonio sat with Jaden in their backyard, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. Jaden leaned against his father, his eyes full of wonder as he gazed up at the endless expanse above them. "Dad," he said quietly, "I'm glad the lion didn't hurt me. I think he knew I was brave." Antonio wrapped his arm around his son, a smile touching his lips. "He did, Jaden. And he showed you that even the strongest creatures can be kind. You were brave, and that's something that will always make you strong." Jaden nodded, his face serious as he listened to his father's words. And as they sat together, bathed in the quiet peace of the evening, Antonio knew that they had found something more valuable than justice or closure. They had found hope, a hope that would carry them forward no matter what challenges lay ahead. Thank you for watching our story. If you enjoyed it and want to see more videos like this, Subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to click on the bell to not miss new episodes. And also, watch other stories on our channel. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. Thank you for being with us.